So I'm in position in the hide, and I'm by no means an expert, but we've come about 3 or 4 times now, would you say?
Yeah.
About 3 or 4 times. So I thought it'd be fun to take you with me with my first outing with the GH6 as well, and show you some photos and videos and some tips. So let's call it 6 tips to get better hide photos, but sort of from the blind leading the blind. The first tip I have, and it's what I've been doing for the last 20 minutes, so don't do what I do, is you don't want to be in a position where you're chasing the birds around. You know, if you see one over here and you move, you see one over here and you move, it's fruitless, and you're not going to get the good compositions, and you're not going to get in focus in time. So the way to go about it is to pick a composition, observe, and be patient. Watch the behaviour of the birds that you want to take the photos of and wait for them to get into position. So go from the feeder to the branch. Sometimes.
Sometimes they just fly away.
Sometimes they just fly away. And speaking of composition, it's personal preference, but I prefer to have less man-made sort of elements in the scene. So I try to stay towards the branches and the logs and the water rather than the sort of man-made bird feeders. Sometimes you can't help it, and it is personal preference, but I like to sort of pretend that it could have been in nature and not in a bird hide. So in terms of settings, I've got my camera in shutter priority, but also manual is fine. I leave it on auto ISO because the exposure changes very regularly, and I'm shooting at 2,000th-ish of a second, because the smaller the object, the more shutter speed you need in order to keep it in focus. And if you want to get the birds in flight, the holy grail of the bird photography, you have to have a higher shutter speed. I've got 3 types of burst mode on this camera. I've got high, medium, and then the 75 frames a second, but using the electronic shutter. So if it's birds in flight, I'm going to go for 75 frames a second. If it's birds just knocking about, I'm going to use high frames a second. Which leads me on to my next tip / observation, and that is you're just going to have to prepare to cull a lot of images. There's going to be a lot of images that are terrible, more so than any other discipline of photography, I would say. So just don't be afraid to shoot and cull later, because it's better to sift through 100 terrible shots to get 1 good shot than to come away with no good shots at all. I've been using my wildlife lens the most, the 100 to 400, but when you are in a bird hide where the birds are so tame and so close, you can absolutely get away with the 35 to 100 or something like that. You can still get very good shots without your dedicated lenses. So I've got my composition ready with the feeder and the trees, and I've got my 75 frames a second ready, and I'm looking out the window, I'm not even looking at the camera. And when the birds are going to fly towards it, I'm going to shoot 75 frames a second and hopefully get them in flight. It's just a patience sort of thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes they'll bugger off and go to a completely different feeder. But when it works really well. The reason I'm looking with my eyes and not on the view screen is because I'm shooting at sort of 400mm or whatever. You only get a very short amount of time as the bird enters the scene if you're looking through the camera. Whereas if you can pre-compose your image and sort of see a wider field of vision with your own eyes, you can see them coming and then press the button and then you get the shot, in theory. Another tip is to try and be comfortable. Like I've got these lovely little beanbag things here, I've got a seat. You could use a tripod on a remote shutter. The last thing you want to do is to be like, you know, leaning forward hunched over for 2.5 hours. You know, you want to be comfortable and observe and actually enjoy the nature as well. So it's not all about the photography, it's cool seeing all these animals. what are you using today, Rebecca?
I have got my Panasonic G9 and the ever trusty 35 to 100 2.8, but I have stolen Emily's 100 to 400 for the wildlife goodness.
And what were you shooting prior to this, before I brainwashed you?
Before you brainwashed me, I had an Olympus Pen F.
I'll show you some of Rebecca's work now. She does amazing portraiture and also animal photography as well, and she is a Micro Four Thirds user, flying the flag, and she's amazing. Mr. Woodpecker! He's so big compared to all the other birds. He was like, this is my feeder. Get your own feeder. Right, I'm going to take off the 75 frames a second for a bit because it is eating up my memory card.
I never know if you're talking to me on the camera.
I don't. So we've got the woodpecker eating the peanut butter, and we put the peanut butter around the side so that it doesn't get in the way of the composition. You should always respect nature, but giving nature a helping hand is fine. Oh, did I get that?
The blue tip just punched him.
The punched it. Please tell me I got that. I'll let you know in a little while. So let's take a look at the video in the GH6. 4K 120p, so you can slow it down to 20% in the timeline, and it really is blink and you miss it moments, so it does make a really big difference. This also records normally with autofocus and audio, so you can use it as a standard clip as well as slow-mo. And then we have the 240p in HD, which is 10% speed. Now these really are blink and you miss it moments, and it's a shame that it's HD, but again, you can record it very easily, and I think it holds up 100 times better than it did in the GH5 with the 180p. And then finally some 4K 60 Old Faithful, just beautiful, gorgeous footage. I really love the video from the GH6. In terms of the raw files, 10,000 ISO. 10,000 ISO, and it works brilliantly. The autofocus was punchy throughout. The burst modes are amazing to play with, and you have so many different options. So my first bird photography venture with the GH6 I think was a huge success. I hope you like the images. I think it's probably time to call it a day when the chickens are out eating the scraps from the other birds. It's been such a great day though.